Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1054th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege to be your MC today for a conversation featuring Lynne Cooke and Suzanne Hudson. And now I'll introduce Lynne and Suzanne. Lynne Cooke, renowned curator and art scholar, is Senior Curator in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Art. She first joined the National Gallery in 2012 as Andrew W. Mellon Professor at the Advanced Study in Visual Arts, the Center. Cooke has received many awards and is widely published. She has authored or written for art journals, including Artforum and the Burlington magazine, and she's written for exhibition catalogues about the work of such artists as Willem de Kooning, Zoe Leonard, Agnes Martin, Richard Serra, and Bill Traylor. An art historian and critic, Suzanne Hudson, is Associate Professor of Art History and Fine Arts at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. She writes with special emphasis on the history, theory, and conventions of painting and process. She is also a regular contributor to Artforum and has penned numerous essays for international exhibition catalogs and artist monographs. She is currently working on Better for the Making, Art Therapy Process, a study of the therapeutic origins of art making within American modernism. And we are very lucky to have Suzanne as a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Suzanne to get us started.
Thanks so much, Chloe, and thanks to everybody at the Rail for facilitating this as always so smoothly, and just very excited to be here and in conversation with Lynne and all of you here as well. And we are going to jump in because the show is amazing and vast and multifaceted, and we want to have plenty of time to share details of the exhibition for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to see it. I should say I had the privilege of seeing it and spending a great deal of time in it when it was in Los Angeles at LACMA. I have not gotten to see it in DC, and I think hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the differences between these sites and installations in due course. But firstly, Lynne, thank you so much for being here and sharing the show and the work. I will also put in a plug just before we start. I have here the amazing catalog, which I'm not sure how much will come up so explicitly today, but it's a really brilliant compendium around a lot of the things that I'm hoping we'll talk about today. So I wanted to refer people to that as well. But I guess to get started, Lynne, will you just share with us something about the background of the show and kind of how it came to be? I know the genesis was in many ways quite long, I guess maybe well, I was gonna say not quite a decade in the making, but in some ways perhaps so. But if you could share with us a little bit about how textile and abstraction and modernism, how these terms started to seem so urgent for you to think through and to think in conjunction.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. I'd just like to begin by thanking you for being the interlocutor in this debate dialogue, and to thank Chloe and her team for, as you say, as Suzanne says, making it so easy and pleasurable. So yes, in 2012, I was offered the Andrew Mellon Professorship at the Center for Advanced Studies in Visual Arts at the National Gallery, and had to propose a paragraph outlining a topic, a project. And I actually wrote two. One of them, the one I began with, turned into the exhibition Outliers, which is around American self-taught art and its interaction with modernist mainstream. And the second was this one that has become Woven Histories. And at the time, I was really struck by a work by young and emerging artists that in various ways engaged with textiles. And in 2018, when the show was greenlighted to go ahead as an exhibition at the National Gallery, Outliers was on the wall. And I thought that what had been a kind of efflorescence in 2012 was becoming a tsunami. And it was in 2018 that the great Annie Albers retrospective took place at Tate and at K20 in Germany. And that followed an exhibition of a retrospective again of Sonia Delaunay. And so at the same time, I was seeing a lot of really fascinating work. And two examples would be the two on the screen, Diedrich Bracken's, an African-American artist who draws on his roots in the South, and diasporic African traditions, including, say, kente cloth, and Igshan Adams, who's based in Cape Town in South Africa, and was brought up by his grandmother and female relatives who introduced him to textiles, and who took up weaving, calls himself self-taught, after graduating from art school. And their work, as you can see, the format is what you might call tapestries or wall hangings, and the technique is weaving. And they weren't the only ones, but amongst the great deal of work I was looking at, they were amongst the most compelling, and it anchored my thinking about work in the present, particularly in relation to weaving or structural textiles.
And how did these, I mean, maybe not these works in particular, although certainly these could do the job, but I mean, how did you start thinking about the definitional terms? And I mean, maybe this is something we can come back to later also, but one of the things that I think is so striking about this exhibition and the way you structure it is that everywhere these terms are kind of palpable, but equivocating or something. Like each one of these works is kind of pressuring the idea of the container from within somehow. And this kind of multivalent, I guess there's so many traditions that are brought to bear on these questions of terms and the apposition of language to any one of them. So I'm wondering how you got to, I guess even some of the language that once you were seeing all this work, like how did these become the terms that were the critical ones to kind of think the show in relation to?
Yes, that's the kind of $1 million question. How to this enormous category called textiles and find something that was cogent and seemed to have some through lines, though not necessarily a single narrative. And it was always based on what I was responding to or felt absolutely kind of like anchor points, whether it was the work of those pioneering vanguard women who turned to textiles with an abstract painting practice in a multidisciplinary practice sometimes, and sometimes rejecting one for the other. But the two were always imbricated. So that was the anchor at one end and this contemporary explosion at the other. And after a lot of trying to put place points in between things that seemed important to consider, I realized that what I was most interested in was what I call structural textiles. So textiles that are made with a technique like weaving or knitting, lace making, felting, knotting, where the technique creates a structure, a planar structure. And that was a very helpful organizing decision. And it meant immediately I left out certain things like stitchery, embroidery, quilting, and other needle techniques that presuppose a pre-existing fabric. And that meant that a lot of the work that, say, second wave feminism was interested in the 70s, that really wasn't applicable. And I think that that area has been very studied, so it wasn't so urgent. And it also took out, for me, the fiber art movement. Artists like Aberconowitz, whose work immediately kind of cleaved to the volumetric.
Mhm.
And so that was one thing. And then also important was the artists would make it themselves. So it wasn't examples of, say, there's a lot of tapestry-based work where an artist sends a sketch or a design to high-end workshop in Brussels or to Oaxaca and has the work made for them. So that the hand was very important. And of course, in the making of cloth for furnishings and fabrics, which is a very important component of Annie Alber's work, the hand looming process through which she designed the swatch was essential. So her hand is there. And then another criterion would be that an artist can engage textile and in some ways put textile at the center of a practice without actually using thread and fiber. And one example might be Gago, whose nets and knotted planar structures. She refused the term sculpture, but and took up net. But this work in particular behaves like a textile. If it hangs and it seems to bend and drape in the way a textile would. So other artists working today use film and photography to consider and critique the production of textiles in outsourced sweatshops in South Asia and elsewhere. So those are some of the guiding frames or premises underpinning the structure. The structure.
Yeah, and maybe actually, Chloe, could we go back to the first installation shot? And Lynne, maybe you could walk us through the show a little bit. In terms of the sections, there are 7 sections, and they're chronological, but not, and they're recursive, I think, in so many wonderful ways. And I think you're in some of our earlier kind of back and forth, the language that I was so struck by when you were kind of talking about it was this idea of like a spatialized argument and narrative that is built through juxtaposition of all kinds. And there it is mediated by text, but remarkably little, actually, for the complexity, I think, of the ideas that are being instantiated through these conversations in each gallery. So maybe you could talk a little bit about not only the way the rooms unfurl and the 7 sections that these ideas are kind of grouped within, but also how you were kind of thinking about this spatialized model of curatorial practice in each of these rooms and settings to bring out these ideas.
Right, thank you, Suzanne. So this installation view is from LACMA, and the installation views that follow will be also, because as you say, Suzanne, that's where we saw it together, and I thought it would be easier to discuss it that way. So each section has a title that was not necessarily what I would have done, but I recognize it's very helpful to people, and it's certainly institutionally it seemed important. So they're not titles that necessarily tell you everything, but and they are different in kind, because each section might be organized thematically or formally or materially. So they don't follow a single model. If we go to this one, Utopian Social Histories, there's an arc from the entrance that goes left, that goes through examples, and you can see a big rug back left by Günter Sturzel that runs through Sonia Delaunay and the Bauhaus through to the Russian constructivists, and it has to do with weaving for mass production. The other arc, the counter movement, and if you go to the next, please. Thanks, Chloe. Is a movement that connects largely through dress and through the significations of dress. But the very first works you see are by Sophie Teuber-Arp, and you see, as in the three examples, that there's a cushion cover, there's a fashion accessory, and there's a watercolor. And Sophie Teuber-Arp's abstract language continues across, and it really was generated by the technical needs of cross-stitch, for example. And those structures then ground her abstraction in textile. So her abstraction is a materialist abstraction, and that, I think, is very different from what the canonical reading of the origins of abstraction are, which is usually located in a kind of simplification of representational forms, as in Cubism, or in metaphysical speculation, as in, say, Mondrian. So this is another kind of abstraction. And the next, please. So here you see Delaunay, who's working at the same time with her version of this geometric abstraction, and the next. And that she transmutes to her work in textiles. And that's designs for the fabrication of textile, of cloth, for furnishings and for attire. And the next. And after she loses a source of private income, she establishes basically a couture business in Paris in 1922 through 1929-30. And these are examples of the garments she makes. And you can see that the dress type is familiar. There's a sheath, and there's what would then probably have been called the flapper dress. She's not interested in inventing new fashion statements. She's interested in having a vehicle for the display of her designs. And both garments, if you look at them, the cloth drapes from the shoulders to the hem without interruption, without darts and other seams that would break it up. And she makes this analogy of living paintings. So that congruence continues between painting abstraction and textile. And importantly, these are the garment types that really represent the new woman of the 1920s. The woman who's has a job outside the home, who's financially independent, who has an autonomy in public space that was unprecedented. And this visual icon, particularly of the flapper dress, is very much in her work as it is in the Russian designs that we'll see. Next, please. Bauhaus, one of the very beautiful works by Günter Stötzel, who was head of the weaving workshop where Annie Albers was enrolled. The next. And you see that same language moving across. This is a work by Joseph Albers, whom Annie married. And here you see examples for textile design and for clothing, particularly workers' clothing, production clothing, in the case of Varvara Stepanova, whose sportswear you see there, and the next. And you see Stepanova in a dress in fabric she designed, in a dress design that she designed and she hand sewed. And the thing is that, of course, she would have liked it, or her vision was for it to be mass produced, ready to wear, available to the new Soviet worker. But the state of industry in the Soviet Union at that point could not allow for this. It was really decimated by the Civil War. And so it was a vision that didn't come into place by the late 20s when industry revived. Of course, Stalinist ideology had shifted from abstraction. So this didn't come about, but the kind of significations of dress are very visible in this, I think. And the next. And Hannah Hirsch who had a day job designing for popular women's magazines, Didama in this instance, and she was designing dress patterns and accessories for apartments. And in this small group of drawing collages, she cuts up these paper patterns for the home dressmaker who would sew her own clothes, and takes on the gendering of synthetic cubism or cubism at large, turning it into ways that give it a kind of feminist underpinning. Next. Section 2 looks at the post-war years in the US, particularly around Albers, who emigrates in 1933 to Black Mountain College, where she teaches and writes, continues her practice, and the next generation, Sheila Hicks, Lenore Tawney, and some artists from that generation, Eva Hesse and Agnes Martin, amongst others. And the common component here is the isolation of thread and liner cognates in this instance. And it begins with the next, please. An unprecedented series of drawings Annie Albers made around 1946, in which it's as if she's gone back to the very beginnings of textile, the thread, and studying the thread, looping and knotting. The next, this is one of her great works. It's really a virtuoso weaving, in which you see line is the organizing structure against a fluid background. And the next, a wall that puts together work by Sheila Hicks, the first two, and Eva Hesse on the right. And the next, you see that this archetypal element in Hicks's work is a long cord-like structure, which seems to be just dropped on the plinth in a way that's very like the kind of installation practices that were current in vanguard circles at the time. And it's made into a cord by taking bundles of thread and binding them with brightly colored silks. Next is a comparison between Agnes Martin and the next, Lenore Tawney, who were very close friends, and looks at reciprocal influences and shared ideas between the two of them. And the next is the third section. So from line, the next component would be a grid, if you're thinking of the way of building a textile or a woven textile. And so foundational to that is work by Albers, but that grid structure is the foremost trope of modernist painting, as we know from, or as Rosenkrantz argued. And it's the hermeticism of that notion of the grid that gets contested by artists like Alan Shields, who do so by turning to textile. And then there's another later part of that same section in which digital technologies form the basis. Components like circuitry, computer chips, as you see in those last three. And then the other element within that section looks at nets as an alternative to the grid. See this here. And within that basketry, diagonal weavings in these cases. And the next is basketry cultures. And the guiding idea behind that is that basketry interlace is a pre-loom textile technology. In terms of the human cultures, basketry is found pretty much everywhere worldwide in different cultures, past and present. Looms are not. And so this is an argument that was made by a peer of Tawney and Hicks, a man called Ed Rosbach, who really midwives a basketry renaissance in this country in the 70s, and you'll see a lot of his baskets here. And in this room, the the interlace technology is seen concurrently in emerging in the work of Furusawa and often in the work of Martin Purrier, and in other cultures, some of which, like Japanese, regard art forms differently, and what we often think of as craft forms can be amongst the most highly venerated of forms, and the bamboo arts are amongst those. And these were part of the research that Rosbach and his fellow teachers at Berkeley and this, you see work by Lillian Elliott, are doing. So it's going across to histories of basketry through enormous range of cultures and traditions. Japanese basketry was being collected on the West Coast by a man called Lloyd Kotzen, who amassed one of the largest collections outside Japan at the same time that Rosbach and Lillian Elliott and others were innovating with basketry forms in Berkeley and around there. And then Yvonne Kumatri is one of many artists working today in basketry forms who draws on her heritage, her own practices as a young woman, a young Aboriginal woman in Australia from the Ngarrindjeri tribal group. And her work circulates as sculpture in contemporary art world. Then this one goes back to the question of how things reiterate and circulate. No, I'm not sure if you can tell, but the basketry section in particular, from those installation slides, you may get an idea of that there's no directional movement, and things, the way of moving around the room allows you to see things constantly in dialogue without any hierarchy or sense of evolution. And something similar is going on in this room, which looks at the way, in the wake of civil rights movement, feminism, gay liberation movement in the 70s, dress becomes highly prioritized as a form of cultural coding, as a way of self-fashioning and signaling participation in subgroups. And this work by Rosemary Truckle, there are 4 women artists here. And at the very moment that Truckle's career takes off with the knit paintings in 1986, she makes more maverick sets, series of garments. So this is using a motif, a Soviet motif from the 20s. This is both a pop painting in some ways, but it's simply fabric yardage that has been stretched. And these are some of the more maverick forms of self-fashioning. This is a video with some shots from something closer to punk, and work by Andrea Zettel, who's same generation, but and with some shared ideas with Truckle, but also defining a kind of way of life with alternative values and ways of working. Paulina Orlovska, a series of paintings based on Somerset cards of garment designs which were banned in Poland and circulated underground, and Ellen Lesperance, whose point of departure is the garments that women at Greenham Common protest in England in the 80s, an anti-nuclear protest, were knitted for themselves, and then she uses these as the basis for paintings, which are also usable patterns for remaking those garments. And then there's labor comes back into focus. If there was labor issues in the interwar years attendant on the relationship between the hand and mechanization in the work of the Soviet artists in the Bauhaus, these are rearticulated in another historic moment, beginning in the 80s, 70s and 80s with Marisa Metz and this kind of amateur practice, so-called, going through to Carol Lung with this very wry standoff between Frau Fiber, who's knitting a sock as a form of craftivist embrace of handcrafting as a form of self-expression and a quiet activism and of anti-capitalism, many claims made for that. And the video is shot in real time, the 4.5 hours it takes her to make it, while the automated knitting machine behind her spits out 99 pairs of white socks. There's a video by Sasha Reichstein, who's Austrian, that she shot clandestinely in a sweatshop in Sri Lanka that looks at practices there. And the last section again looks at photo coding in the form of attire and also wall hangings, but thinks about communities not as subcultures, but occupying the center. Queer communities, communities based in indigenous identity, in a kind of vision of the interdependence between human and non-human species in the case of Anne Hamilton. And the Pride dress, Liz Collins and Gary Graham. It was one of a series of dresses made. They're going to manifest the 7 deadly sins. It's, I think in retrospect, one can see this evening dress, which has been such a together in this technique that Liz uses, it's particular to herself, from the shards of American flags. One can see it as a rich symbol for the gender wars that roil this country now. And that's where the work of Diedrich and Igshan is placed within that dialogue. Mm-hmm. I think that's the end of the slideshow.
Well, thank you so much. I didn't want to preempt anything in case, but maybe because we're back to where we started in a kind of more contemporary example than some of the ones we were just looking at. I mean, I wanted to kind of ask you, because it's something that I've really been trying to think about in relation to your show and what it opens up. I mean, I love how you think about materialist abstraction through this and a different kind of origin story or a different way of conceiving of genealogies or opening up kind of models for thinking around things we thought we knew. And maybe in that accounting for different modes of labor and also change over time and why that might happen. But I also have had a really, I don't know, I mean, I'm still grappling with how to think this as a form of history, or is this really an argument about the contemporary or how these things fit together? And I wonder if you might, I don't know, kind of respond to that or help me out, I guess, in some way, how to think about these historical examples or genealogies, but also this real presentism. And I don't mean that as a criticism, but I feel like there's a real set of stakes that you're articulating throughout, but especially keenly in this last section of works that we're ending on, that are really arguing for a different read, not only backwards, but also how all of this impinges upon us right now. So anything you might want to say or kind of share in response to that?
Thanks, Suzanne. It's a great question. Maybe I'd answer in two slightly different ways. One is that, as you say, we look at the past through the present, because we're condemned to that, if you like. But the artists, many of the artists I'm looking to in the present are also looking at the past very specifically, and not, it seems to me, at that 60s moment, which was so fertile for emerging artists in the 80s, 90s, so on. But they're looking to the interwar years and really the 20s, since so much of what I was talking about is over by 29, 33. And so I think, and one can see direct references in the Truckle, in Jeffrey Gibson, I think, to Sonia Delaunay often, and to other things, of course. But it's infiltrating their work in productive ways. So that would be part of it. I think that textiles are such an important component in the GNP of any country. Textiles are the largest single employee of women worldwide. Textiles are foregrounded at this moment constantly, whether it's the horrors of fast fashion and labor practices or environmental disasters that come with the production of cloth and clothing today. So it's very central. And I think that we see it being addressed and articulated in many different ways, which I find fascinating. And that was one of the impulses, to try and allow for different ways of addressing this, and also to avoid some of the cliches. There's work by Senga Ngudi called The Threader, which is, there are very few videos in her work, but this one looks at an employee from the Salamandre company who works on passementerie, the cords that, for example, tie up luxurious cords that tie velvet curtains back. And he's very skilled. He's been doing it a long time. And Senga Ngudi was fascinated by the movements he makes and the economy of them, the grace of them in this practice skilled labor. And that's what this short film really acknowledges and pays homage to. So it's a different notion of labor and skilled labor, as distinct from what maybe oversimplifying we often think of as labor in sweatshops as being de-skilled, but these are more complicated terms than perhaps ready-made formulation would indicate. So that's part of it. I think the other part, it's not one history, certainly, and it's the original title for the show was Braided Histories, and I chose the term braided because a braid is an interlace of three or more strands. They're all equally woven. Equally weighted, and they all begin the braid and they're all present at the end. And so somehow that was a useful model for trying to link some of these larger thematics through the show, allowing them to surface again in ways that are historically specific, whether it's issues around medium specificity and so, but not calling them out as subjects and doing mini histories, because I think these exchanges between abstraction, modernist abstraction and textile are multifaceted at every moment, and looking at those under other less familiar headings, I hoped would provide a space in which to rethink some of our received ideas.
Can I ask you also, I'm struck, and I'm sure people watching the images that have come past us for the last few minutes, we'll notice that the vast majority of works in your show are made by, female identifying artists. I wonder where, you know, of these various histories, like where's feminist history, or what is the relation of this? I mean, I think it's kind of amazing in its provocation of naming this nowhere, but being kind of everywhere felt, and even in relation to these different modes of labor that you're describing, starting with things that are worn, ending with things that are worn, the intimacy of bodies, ideas of embodiment throughout certain kinds of bodies. Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, you know, how you're imagining feminist history as one of the kinds of histories that this is performing, I guess, in some ways, or reimagining from this vantage.
Well, I think if one thinks of feminist histories or history, and writing of feminist histories, it's to be attentive to the conditions and circumstances and needs and desires of women as practitioners, throughout this time. But I think at the same time, it's important not to suppose that all these women occupied the same places within the artistic cultures of their day, or the orbits that they moved in. So in the interwar years, all those artists I've named, they were in the forefront of the historical avant-gardes. I'm not saying it's an even playing field. There's only one woman, Hannah Hirsch, within Berlin Dada and so on, but they had significant places in these vanguard movements, and so they're participating at the cutting edge of the dialogues at the moment. And by contrast, if you look at the second section, there's Eva Hess in artistic circles, in very self-consciously cutting edge circles in downtown Manhattan, and Sheila Hicks, who's part of the studio crafts movement and whose orbits are entirely different, and whose the designation of her work is going to be craft as a medium-specific practice. And so the places of these female-identified makers within the dialogues of the time are very different. And I think that obviously Hicks and Hess wouldn't have shown at the same institutions. One would be at the Museum of American Craft and one at the Museum of Modern Art. And they were unaware of each other, probably, at least for part of the time, despite the fact they'd both been painting students of Joseph Albers at Yale in the later 50s. And yet, on the other hand, within that same moment, Agnes Martin and Lynne Cooke both have studios, lofts, living spaces in lofts in Coenty Slip, and their interdependence, their creative and interdependence, their personal relations are of another order, and are not, again, their work circulates in different spaces, but it doesn't, as far as I can tell, until Martin leaves City in the later 60s, it doesn't stop that or interrupt that dialogue, and it continues to be fertile to both of them. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I'm answering your question very directly, but maybe by example.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, thinking about the situatedness of these, the kind of way that the show is precisely trying not to flatten, but preserve the differences, but to also think about exhibition making, I guess, as a form of intervention within this, or pulling out certain threads, I guess, as it were. And the question of gender and potentially feminism also in relation to that is something that I think is, as I say, kind of everywhere felt in the show, but not really something that, for example, like the wall or the didactic materials are especially let's say, didactic about or explicit about, but it's kind of more felt. And maybe actually, you know, that's something to ask about too. And I haven't seen this in DC. And so maybe this is also a segue just to ask maybe one final question, because I can see there's a lot of activity in the chat, and then we can open this up. But to think about the differences as you moved the show from Los Angeles to DC, which is where people who will encounter it now will see it, or a subsequent venue thereafter, possibly New York. I mean, it is going to New York, but possibly people will have the opportunity to see it in New York as well. But how you thought about text, mediating it? I mean, it's, at least in LA, I mean, there was so little on the walls in terms of, you know, framing information. And I thought it was kind of, I don't know, self-consciously light and deliberately so. And really, I felt, as someone walking through it, a kind of implicit argument being made that it was incumbent upon the viewer to kind of look carefully and to think, and that there was information, to be sure, but not an overwhelming amount. And so I guess I'm wondering whether that was also preserved in the movement into the National Gallery, and what else potentially has changed in terms of thinking about this work for a different audience, in its new venue.
Thank you. With respect to text, the institutions are very different. The labels, well, there are a few object labels in Los Angeles, and the wall text for each gallery I wrote and then were edited. So in this, that's my voice to there. And the galleries in Los Angeles are purpose designed as galleries by Renzo Piano, and there's a very formal enfilade. So there's one module, and you encounter the galleries on a rhythm that's something like 1, 1, 2, being a double, 2, and so on. So the procession through the galleries is given, and the sense of space is predetermined, but then it can be interrupted or articulated differently. So as I said before, there's quite a formal organization around the edges of the first gallery, with a pivot in the center being provided by the Donnelly dresses. But the basketry gallery you came in, and the huge Purrier net that hung from floor to ceiling, sort of right in your face, and you're up in it and close, and then you could move in different directions, but there was no given pathway. And there's a kind of leveling there. The orchestration is less choreographed. The sense that the subject is moving much more outside one historical moment is clearer. And many people have said, both in Los Angeles and at the National Gallery, where that particular gallery is installed similarly, that it's amongst their favorite in the show. And obviously many reasons for that. Partly the material's unexpected and unfamiliar to most people. It was certainly unfamiliar to me when I began this project. And there's something refreshing perhaps in that. But I think also there's a kind of leveling of the playing field in relation to all visitors. Like, very few people are going to come in with any background in this material. And in that sense, there are not two or more types of audience that are overlaid, as always is the case in any exhibition, where there are the more professionalized or the more intentional visitors and the casual visitor who may not have even intended to see the show when they arrived at the museum. They are all mixed in together inevitably. But there's a kind of what I just called even playing field, which is that nobody's in a privileged position, but baskets aren't arcane or alien. They're very much part of our lives, our heritage. And there's something visceral about them. And it's easy to read how they're made, in that the structure makes not a surface, it makes the whole thing, and inside and outside are identical in a way that a complex weaving structure by, say, Lenore Tawney may be hard to somebody who isn't familiar with those techniques to unpack. That's not true of the basketry. And some of them look as if the Lillian Elliott's that she simply picked up a bunch of twigs and twisted them to make a provisional container. And one can imagine in the far deep past, people doing that. They took what was to hand and they made, improvised and worked that way. And so this is becoming a long answer, but there is a way in which I think you can play around with that that's somewhat different from in many of the other sections. And in a way that's at one end of the spectrum of not providing a lot of guidance and information. And there's more that has to do with situation in some of the others. Or to do with, in the case of the extended labor with the Hannah Hirsch, the fact she had that day job, so you can kind of know where that material and the significance of it is.
Well, thank you. Chloe, should we open this up? I know there's lots of things popping up in the chat, and I want to make sure we have time for.
Yeah, we have one question from the audience. And if anyone else in the audience would like to ask a question to Lynne, please feel free to post it in the chat. We'd love to hear everybody's questions. But I will allow for, I believe, let me find the question that we do have. It's going to be from Anna Carey. So Anna, I'll give you the chance to unmute to ask directly.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciated your kind of presenting a certain crossover or cross-pollination between craft and art. And I was struck when you were discussing the grids section, I guess the third section. If you could comment on the relationship between quilts, and I'm thinking of like the amazing quilts from Gee's Bend in Alabama, but also what struck me as well was an exhibit going on now at MoMA PS1, the Navajo weaver Melissa Cody and her abstract weavings. Thank you.
Thank you. Chloe, if you can find the Alan Shields in the third section, that would be helpful, I think. Thanks for the question. It's a very central one. What I was interested in drawing out was the way in which, in part, artists in the 70s who their formation for abstract artists was a dialogue in which the grid was an incredibly important trope. And to many of them, it seemed a kind of dead end. And one way of getting out of this, to bring art back into the world, was to make their work in material terms. And so what Alan Shields is doing is taking canvas strapping and weaving a support, which is at once, and then he's dyeing it. So it's at once the painting and the ground, and then it's being embellished with rows of strings of beads. And so there's there's a play on the canvas, the traditional support of painting, on how a woven structure is made as an orthogonal grid that's basic to it, and the materiality, the everyday of cloth in our lives as part of the world. And that's really what I was interested in, or later on, the digital with computer chips in the case of Mary-Lou Schultz. As I said earlier, there are a vast range of textiles across human history, and I've taken a particular pathway through it, and I chose not to look at textiles that are made or elaborated with needles as a bringing together of pre-existing fabric, as in quilt making or as in embroidery. It was one component within textile production. Another would be the kind of tapa cloth that's made from neither of those forms. It's made by beating and melding. There are many, many forms, but my chosen form were these structural technologies like knitting, felting, and weaving.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Anna, and thank you for that very generous answer, Lynn. The next question today is going to be from Fong at The Rail. Fong, I'm going to give you the chance to unmute to ask.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Suzanne. I have to go to a meeting, but I would definitely re-listen to it later this weekend for sure. Thanks for coming on. Lynn, I can be wrong, but I remember someone told me that you start out curating the first show that based on Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. And I happen to have the Penguin Books version of it, which is super rare. What is my question? My question is the Alfred Jensen's great show 2002, I think. I got here with our friend Chris Martin, who wrote the fantastic review on The Rail, where at some point he was so excited that I was editing at the time. I couldn't take the word out. Its own capital, quote unquote, holy shit. That's what his response to the show. And I love your text on the catalog. Concordance. It's a great, great, incredible show which inspired the widow, Regina Bogart, to invite Chris and I to come and visit his studio, his home and studio in Glenville, New Jersey. So Alfred Jensen had played an important role to a lot of our thinking. And I'm thinking in Alfred, that incredible cosmic mysticism, because he's born in a very unusual background. Growing up in Guatemala, introduced into Aztec culture, calendar, Mayan calendar and other mystical ideas. But thinking in terms of your trajectory, I mean, your show, your support of Rosemary Trockel, to me, thinking about Alfred Jensen, Suzanne, and the same thing with Rosemary, it's a similar application of term, because you guys talking about labor feminism. And that was very popular in the 20s and certainly have a great deal to do with pushing forward the Equal Pay Act in 1963, So I think my question is that it's always been in your alchemy, thinking in this very curatorial practice without being militant. The subtlety's always been there. So I just want to ask whether it has always been that way since the get-go, because I don't know how long ago that show was in Melbourne that you did it. Must have been in late 70s, maybe?
Mid 70s, yes. A long time, Fong. And thank you. I it's a very generous reading and a wonderful reading that links those particular things. I think you're very prescient or very perspicacious. There is a lot of continuity and continuation, for sure. I think one of the things that's always been important to me is a direct encounter with an artwork, and the way that understanding isn't purely intellection. It's through the body, it's visceral, it's sensorial, and mostly it involves some kind of kinetic response, like walking around it, walking along. That's where some deep knowledge resides, and that's what I hope to build on when putting, amongst other things, when putting artworks together in constellations, and to draw out some of those responses by visitors who are willing and able to experience artworks in those ways that really don't prioritize a didactic text or an unfolding of an argument that sequences rooms with artworks as illustrations in a textual argument.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about how puritanical the application of minimalism can be. And it's so restricted to a certain kind of temperament that not quite applicable to a certain artist. You mentioned Alan Shear, which is a great example, because I think that was the show, if I remember, that Katie Siegel did with David Reed. It's called Hot Time, Good Time, Hot Time, I think, New York paintings in 65 or 67 to 75. And that was the period that when painting was put back in the burner, right, Suzanne? Because minimalist sculpture was predominant trend. So I think everyone had to reinvent himself, herself, or themselves. What to do with the grid, particularly as you point out, also material emphasis. It was a way to break out of from that formality, so to speak. So I really appreciate the last epic show you did too, which you coined the term, which I've been using forever, outlier. You know, so how do you continue that history without making it so explicitly mandatory in terms of the easy language usage, and so to speak. But that show is very important. I think it paved the way for people rethinking it, that whole history altogether. So I'm grateful. Thank you, Lynne. Thank you, Suzanne. And looking forward to re-listen to the whole thing this weekend. So congratulations. Can't wait to go see the show next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Fong. Thank you.
Thank you, Fong. Our next question, Lynn, is going to be from Glenn Adamson. Glenn, I'll pass you the mic to ask.
Hi there, Lynn. Great to see you here with the Brooklyn Rail. I'm actually over in London right now, and I just was able to see the exhibition at the Barbican. I'm not sure if you would have had a chance to see that, but I was thinking about that. And of course, the exhibition that's on at the Metropolitan right now, comparing Peruvian ancient works with 20th century and 21st century works. And I'm just wondering what your assessment is of why fiber art is having such a moment, I suppose, both institutionally and also in terms of audience and art market interest in the medium.
I think it's a multi-pronged answer, and I think Suzanne would also, I'd love to hear what she thinks. One part of it, I think, is within a globalized world, artists are drawing on heritage, vernacular traditions, a situated context in ways that open up ways of working that are outside the most expected or the most conventional within a smaller North American, European art world. But that said, there's been, since the 70s, of course, a great widening of forms and practices. But I think we're seeing another moment in which, without appropriating from other cultures, as some of the work from that the 70s and 80s might be seen to do, artists are looking within their own histories and their own genealogies and heritages. So that's contributing to a much more diversified set of practices right now. I think as I was trying to say earlier, what textile is today, just in terms of apparel, the apparel industry, the kind of production of its basic materials, is something we read about all the time. It's so significant and so substantial in terms of its implications. And I think artists are drawn to big questions, and that would be part of it also. And Suzanne, can you add more?
No, I mean, I would happily turn it back around to Glenn, because I would be incredibly curious your thought on this. I don't feel that I have a lot to add beyond what you said. I mean, it's something that I've been noting. I've not gotten to London since that's been up, so I can't respond to that part of it either. But I do feel like it's a little bit like seeing the red car, and then you see the red cars everywhere, and this kind of ubiquity of shows of this kind, or bringing textiles in, or galleries. I mean, monographic shows. I don't just mean kind of institutional thematic, but also attention to individual artists, practitioners who are working in this vein. I feel like it is kind of everywhere, and I'm not sure what to make of that. I mean, I will say, like, one very cynical thought that I've had, if I may, like, in my candor, I mean, it seems that it's easier to move around than materials of other kinds, and less fragile, less prone to breakage or other things. It just seems like in a moment where issues also of sustainability, both in terms of the ecology of kind of institutions, as it were, but thinking about the waste involved in what we all do of all kinds, both on the production side and on the reception side, it seems like maybe there's some dimension of this that satisfies certain of these very pragmatic considerations, but also kind of points to other ways of making being, and also gets away from, say, plastics or other kinds of toxic materials. So anyway, those are some of my maybe more both cynical, but I guess in the end, maybe more, I don't know, something other than cynical thoughts on this. But I would actually be really curious. I mean, especially since you're coming off the heels of just having seen the Barbican one, but just from your position more generally, I'd be so curious what you think.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. I certainly think looking at those practicalities is always a good idea. I can't remember who said this to me, but somebody said the most important parameter in contemporary art in New York is what will fit in the elevator of an East Side apartment building. So I think you're probably onto something there, although I also see the fiber art enthusiasm as having followed hard on the heels of the one for ceramics, which is still going. And of course, ceramics is about as ecologically inefficient and fragile and difficult to ship a medium as we have. So I think in addition to the points that you've both made, I guess I would just say that it seems like one of the most legitimate ways for art institutions to bring other voices to the table, because of course these are the very mediums in which women especially, but also people of color often were able to exercise their creative practices, because they were not entirely, but often forcibly excluded from realms that were designated as fine art. And so in returning to those histories which have been marginalized necessarily, you have an opportunity to bring those marginalized voices to the table as well. And I think that's maybe the best reason for the rediscovery of these figures. And of course, there's also something that Lynn said earlier, which is that there's a kind of accessibility for the general public. So I think you were talking about basketry, and talking about the almost self-evident nature of the tactility and the structure of those objects. And I do think that institutions, again, for very good reasons, are looking for narratives that both have a lot of integrity and complexity, but also have a kind of accessibility to them. And it seems like these craft disciplines offer all of that at once.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Glenn, for that question. And thank you, Suzanne and Lynn, for your answers. I think that's going to conclude our Q&A for today. But I want to thank you all for those incredibly thoughtful questions. And I want to thank Suzanne and Lynn for this conversation, which has been completely luminous and lovely to listen to. I also, of course, want to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where you'll be able to watch this conversation very soon. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years, and a donation directly supports our writers, our staff, and our operations. You could support our work through the link in the chat if you're able, and if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Stephanie Sihuko and Tausif Noor on the occasion of Sihuko's show Dodge and Burn at Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for being here on this sunny Friday in Brooklyn, at least for me. And I hope you all take care this weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Lynn. Thank you, Suzanne. Go see the show, everybody, if you can.
Everybody.